live. So, welcome, everybody. Welcome to the talk here, part-time work, putting the pieces together. You know, many of us graduate, enter the workforce, and find ourselves working part-time at first. Maybe before a full-time job opens up, or maybe before we find that dream job that is, 5 days a week, 6 days a week, whatever it is. That's kind of certainly how I started out, kind of part-time, and then I transitioned into a full-time kind of position. And, some people might say, man, I'm part-time right now. I wish I could just find one full-time job. But others might actually find a lot of advantages to part-time work and, making the most of it. So I am joined here with Dr. Sathi Maiti, an OD practicing in the Seattle area. She's working two part-time jobs, one as a leaseholder inside C Eyewear and another as a part-time associate at a private practice. So before we jump into the talk, for those that have been following along with us live, I wanted to just drop in the next raffle code word for those of you who are collecting these and gaining additional entries. So the code word, the secret code, so to speak, the Easter egg is retail. So RETAIL. So you can use that to gain additional entries into our raffles. I guess we could jump into it. Sathi, thanks for joining us. And, I wanted to have you on just to talk about why it actually might be advantageous to work part-time in a few different places and kind of piece together a schedule rather than looking for that full-time position. So, I've got some questions here that I'd like to ask you just to kind of get your insight. Why don't you just kind of kick it off and tell us, what are, the major cons of working part-time and having that piece together schedule, but specifically, what are the major pros?
Yeah, so there's certainly, a lot of pros and cons, both for part-time work and, and full-time work as well. I'd say sort of grossly, the major benefit of part-time work is just flexibility. You're not sort of locked down to a specific schedule. You can take time off and stuff more easily. Versus like the big con is sort of lack of security, lack of benefits. So I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail with that. I'd say, kind of go into pros a little bit more first. Like I mentioned, flexibility is a really big one. So if you only want to work 4 days a week, or you want to work 6 days a week, or even 7 days a week, you can. You could work a couple of days at one practice, a couple of days at another practice. Versus with a full-time gig, you're usually kind of locked down to, specific days of the week a practice is going to want you Tuesday through Saturday or Monday through Friday or whatever. And the nice thing about part-time work is it allows you to kind of do a lot of different types of work at the same time. So particularly as a new grad, you kind of should be in the mentality of wanting to test out things. You don't really know right out of school, like, do you want to work in a primary care private practice, or do you want to work, in retail or for a specialty type of clinic? And part-time work makes it really easy to kind of try out things. Like I had a friend right out of school who worked for a private practice for a couple of days and then worked for a BV practice for a couple of days. And so it's a really nice way to kind of test out if you're thinking about a specialty without kind of jumping and fully committing and realizing like, oh, actually, I don't like VV that much. You can kind
Right.
of test it out
Yeah,
a couple of
totally.
days and find out. Other benefits, I think, are particularly for people that are maybe thinking about opening up their own private practice eventually, is taking it as a learning opportunity to learn from different practices. Because you will learn, as you work for different doctors and in different settings, that there's so many different ways you can go about running a practice, in terms of what type of staff you have, if you have an office manager doing certain things, down to things just like what do they ask on the intake form? How are they scheduling patients? What equipment is there? You get to kind of test out all these different things, kind of without too much investment. Um,
Right.
So it lets you then later on, if you're going to open your own practice, kind of figure out, well, what did I see that worked, that I liked, versus what kind of stuff did I not like and not want to do, and kind of find out what works for you, what style you like, what you don't like. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think in addition, it kind of gives you the opportunity to just test out a lot of different stuff in terms of equipment as well. Different practices are going to have different visual field machines, different retinal cameras. You'll get to test out all that stuff too and kind of figure out what you like and what you don't like. That can also kind of be a con in that if you're working at different practices, you kind of have to be familiar with all the different equipment each day of the week too, which can sometimes be a little bit tough. It's like, okay, one day I got the octopus visual field and I got to know
Yep.
how to interpret that. And then the next day I've got, an FTT and I got to, figure out how to interpret that. So those are kind of pros and cons.
Uh-huh. Yeah, for sure. I know, one thing that always pops up, and, I'm not an accountant, none of us are accountants, none of us are tax attorneys, that kind of thing. But I know that a lot of times there can be some discussion around the differences in sort of those tax situations, right? Between having that part-time sort of situation, which a lot of times is 1099 versus W-2. And, we don't have to go into the specifics of that, but I mean, in your experience, has there been any sort of advantages that you have found, as far as taxes go or anything?
Yes. So I'd say that is probably like the biggest difference between part time and full time. Full time is almost always going to be a W 2, like straight employee position where they'll withdraw your taxes each paycheck. And like your taxes are really simple. You just, input your W 2 and stuff for your annual taxes. Versus part time, generally, I'd say you'll be an independent contractor, 1099. I think this is maybe changing a little bit. I have seen more part time jobs that are W 2. But I'd say historically, and probably even still now, the majority are going to be 1099. The downside of this is it almost never comes with any additional benefits. You're not going to get health insurance. You're not going to get a 401k. You're not going to get paid time off or sick leave or anything like that. But the main benefit of 1099 is you can typically negotiate a higher pay rate because you're going to be paying a higher portion of your taxes. You can usually say to the owner doc, like, hey, I think I should get paid a little bit more. And they're oftentimes willing to do that. And then the other big advantage is you get to deduct a lot of expenses that you just can't do as a W 2. So things like, your car expenses potentially, you could have home office expenses that you can deduct, all kinds of things. So like stuff you're paying for CE equipment, your license fees, that kind of stuff, that you just can't deduct if you're an employee. And, I have some friends that have kind of been really lucky to kind of get the benefits of both, where they might have one part time job that's a W 2 and comes with some of those benefits where they get some paid time off or paid CE. And then they have another gig that's 1099. So they kind of get like the best of both worlds, which is awesome because then you can still deduct your expenses.
Right.
Um, the other downside, though, is the taxes as 1099. It's just more complicated. You have to keep track of all your income and expenses throughout the year. You have to pay quarterly taxes every 3 months or so, to where I think it's really beneficial to have an accountant or at least discuss, at least sometimes with an accountant, because you can do things like set up your own business. I think this can be really helpful in terms of setting up an LLC or something, or even things like doing an S corp can be to your tax advantage. So there's a lot of ways you can actually make this work in your favor tax wise. You just have to put in a lot more of the work.
Right. Yeah, and another thing that kind of pops up a lot, at least, questions that get asked, and, this kind of actually plays in perfectly because a couple of questions just popped up in the chat, and, it's around kind of finding that balance or kind of coordinating your schedule, right? So, a question came up: how do you balance your time between different practices without feeling like you're spreading yourself too thin? So, any thoughts on that? Is there like a sweet spot, so to speak, of number of different part-time jobs that you kind of run? Is it two? Is it three? Is three too many? Is four just way too many?
Yeah, I think definitely, particularly right out of school, I think it's very common for ODs to work like 6 days a week or sometimes even 7 days a week. Because, we got student loans, you want to pay them off, you want to work as much as you can while you're young and you have the energy. But it's really tricky to not spread yourself too thin. So my general recommendation is, try to at least only do 6 days. Like 7 days of work is just that's just tough. You don't have any time to just do stuff like laundry and stuff like that. So generally, I'd say like 5 or 6 days is kind of doable. Almost no one I know keeps doing 6 or 7 days like that many years out. I'm about 5 years out now from school, and I had a lot of classmates right out of school. We were doing 6, 7 days. Almost no one is doing that anymore. We're all kind of down to 5 days. And I absolutely agree with you. The more practices you're working at one time, the kind of more stretched out you're going to be, because it's just so much more to keep track of okay, what time do I go in each day? It might be different. How are the patients scheduled? It's
Mhm.
different. The way the techs are doing things, you're keeping track of all these different things, and you kind of got to jump into that mindset every day. So
Right.
typically, I think about 2 or 3 practices is about the max that's kind of doable. For me
Hmm.
personally, I think about two is ideal because you can kind of invest yourself in each one enough. But I think three is also potentially doable. Beyond that, you're just going to be tired.
Yeah, and it's funny because someone asked a great question here, kind of that has a lot of similarities to some of the things you were just discussing, and that is, how do you go about really proposing part-time work at two different practices? Because I'd imagine that many practices kind of want you to give them that weekend, right? A weekend day at least or something. So, do you have any strategies or any sort of advice for kind of coordinating that aspect, kind of proposing it? And then there's a follow-up question there, but let's talk about that first, just kind of schedule coordination.
Yeah, I think this is probably the trickiest thing about part time. Is like they were saying, almost every practice wants you for that Saturday. Like Saturday is the most valuable day that owners want someone to work. And so that day is usually going to be the easiest for you to fill because there's going to be just so many more opportunities. So I think ideally, if you can find those part-time jobs that don't need a Saturday, to try to lock that down first. Because, if you're working somewhere Monday, Tuesday, then it's going to be easier for you to fill in, that Saturday somewhere else. Versus if you lock down, like working Saturday and a couple of days somewhere else, it might be harder to fill in weekdays at another practice. I think what's really important is just being really honest and open with whoever your employer is, whether it's private practice or retail, and letting them know like the other places you're working and the days you're working and what you're doing so that they know what's going on in your life and can kind of help you figure that out. I think a lot of the time practices are actually more flexible in what days they'll have you work than you'd think. And I think this comes even when you're looking at jobs. Oftentimes jobs will be posted saying they're looking for someone 3 days a week, but you talk to the doctor and they really like you. They might be willing to have you for only 2 days a week if that's all you have. So it's really good to kind of ask and say like, hey, I really like this, but I can't give you the 3 days. I can only give you the 2 days, but that might still work. So don't, just knock out opportunities without kind of asking and seeing what's out there. But yeah, once you lock down that Saturday, it can be tough to kind of fill in the gaps otherwise. So that's why, like I said, I'd recommend try to fill in weekdays first if you can, because it'll be easier to fill in that Saturday versus just weekdays.
Yeah, and just from personal experience too, I found that, a potential kind of solution, so to speak, if you have someone who is really adamant about you working that Saturday and they like you and you like them and you want to make it work out, but you're already committed to a Saturday somewhere else, you could always suggest an evening, you know what I mean? I found that evenings are also very valuable for a lot of practices. So that's another kind of option, is just to say, hey, I can't do a Saturday, but how about we look at me giving you, some evening hours on Monday or Tuesday or whatever that may be. So it's another way to kind of make things work, so to speak, particularly if the employer really likes you and you really like them. So as another kind of, just some additional advice, so to speak, I guess, just based off of personal experience. But another question came in, and that question is around contracts. So have you found that part-time jobs usually are more year-to-year type contracts, kind of month-to-month contracts, or, what has your experience been?
I think it varies a lot. I think typically they're less stringent than a full time contract just because, everyone is sort of more flexible with these things. So, I've worked part time jobs, which I don't recommend doing this without contracts, where there's sort of nothing in writing. You probably shouldn't do that, but it does leave a lot of flexibility. I tend to find in general, most of them are pretty flexible though. So, in terms of leaving part-time jobs, I think it's generally easier than leaving full-time jobs as well because you generally just don't have to give as much notice. You may only have to give, a few weeks notice. Um, I personally, I'd say probably the longest part-time contract I have seen is like about a year, and then you kind of decide like at that year mark, maybe we'll talk over things again. But I think it's generally understood that you could sort of leave at any time, given that you
Mm-hmm.
would give enough notice. And I think part time employers kind of understand that. Like they know typically that you probably aren't necessarily going to stay in this job forever. Because I think they know unless they are able to maybe potentially offer you more days or a full time job down the road, you are potentially looking at other opportunities. I think everyone is kind of aware of that. And so the flexibility in terms of coming and going is a little bit more open. The kind of nice thing about working part time in places too is like even if you leave the regular, like working there every week or something, sometimes they'll often still keep you on as like fill in. So you can sort of still keep working places if you want, and it sort of works for everyone because you already know how everything works. And so if they go on vacation and they need someone, even if you're working somewhere else, you can kind of help them out, keep those relationships going.
Yeah, definitely. And, a couple of other questions popped up, and I think they're really great questions. So if you're kind of watching us live, following along, please feel free to ask questions. We're definitely find, questions tend to be always super valuable in the discussion. So keep it up, keep up the good work for those of you who are watching. So a couple questions came in, and we talked a little bit about this earlier on when we just kind of went live, and that was around taxes, right? So how do you typically figure out your taxes with having 1099 and W-2 and deductions? Do you use an accountant? If yes, are they specific to optometry? So probably before we answer this, we should preface this by we are not accountants and cannot give that, the whole disclaimer thing, of course. But, I'll let you kind of tackle this one just in my own personal experience, because I was in the scenario early on in my career. I kind of did them myself. I probably would recommend you get professional help. I don't know that they need to be specific to optometry. At one point, I did seek professional help, and this person was not specific to optometry, and it worked out just fine. But I'll let you kind of take it away. I don't know what your experience has been.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I pretty much agree with you. I have done kind of a combination of trying to do my own taxes as well as work with an accountant. One that I worked with, he was not specific to optometry, but he had actually worked with quite a few other local optometrists, which is how I found him. So I'll so he like did other kinds of taxes, but had worked with optometrists in a similar position to mine, which was really great because he knew where I was coming from. But I don't think it's really necessary because as an independent contractor, we're actually similar to a lot of other types of workers doing their taxes. So I don't think there's as much that really sets us apart in terms of accounting like me. I would say, really recommend talking to an accountant. Whether you continue on working with them, if you're kind of savvy with accounting stuff and feel like you can do it yourself, I think you probably can do your taxes on your own. But I think it helps at least have that initial conversation early on when you're starting, because they will help you with things like figuring out should you start an LLC or should you start an S corp. Those kind of things are kind of hard to figure out on your own unless you like really know a lot about taxes and business stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
but
And you know what? Interestingly enough, another question popped up, and I know there's a question about evenings. We'll get to that one in just a second. But while we're on the topic of taxes, I wanted to ask you, how do you keep your books and records to organize write-offs? And you know, my experience was I used Excel, and I saved every receipt possible. But you know, what about you? Did you use QuickBooks or anything?
yeah, so I actually use QuickBooks. They have a self-employed QuickBooks. It's super easy. You can actually just connect your bank account to it, and it like transfers all the transactions, and you can categorize them business versus personal. So I found QuickBooks to be very easy. I think there's other software like that you can use. Um, I think a lot of us as optometrists, we're kind of like diligent and good at keeping track of stuff already. It's just sort of the way we are. So keeping track of these kind of expenses isn't that big of a deal if you kind of do it as you go. So I think, yeah, doing Excel or using QuickBooks and sort of every day or every couple of days going through your transactions makes it really easy. If you're the type of person that doesn't want to do that and you kind of wait till every 3 months and do it, that can be a little bit harder. But there's a lot of great software out there to help you if you don't want to hire an accountant. And honestly, keeping track of stuff isn't that hard because, we don't have a ton of expenses typically. So it's not like a ton of stuff to keep track of. And usually the more years you do it, kind of it's the same stuff you're doing all the time. So I'd say for sure look into something like QuickBooks, or you could, use Excel. You definitely want to use some kind of spreadsheet or system, and like you did, keep all your receipts, keep track of everything. The more organized you are, the easier it is.
Yeah, organization is key, honestly, and documentation. Have documentation. It's super critical. And you know, shifting away a little bit from taxes, I guess you can say, and back towards scheduling. There's a question about that, and then maybe you can, you know, in the little bit of time we have left, you can kind of just share your final top tips. But before we get to those, a question popped up, and that was, which evenings have you found to be most productive for the doctor and therefore more desirable for the doctor employer? And I think this was kind of going back to when we started talking about coordinating your schedule and maybe offering an evening hour. And, you know, in my experience, it was kind of, quite honestly, evenings just in general seem to be effective. I think that, you know, maybe not so much a Friday evening, but something during the week. You know, I've worked evenings on Monday, Tuesdays, Wednesdays even, and all three were probably pretty equally productive in terms of number of patients on the schedule, and then in terms of kind of revenue generation. But, you know, what has your experience been?
Yeah, I'd say exactly the same. I think Monday through Thursday is kind of the evenings that are going to work. I have a friend that works, I think, Wednesday evenings. That works really well because it's kind of midweek, so I think she's usually pretty booked up. And I think she only works like 4 hours that day or something. So that's kind of the nice thing too about evenings is you could either do it on top of another job you're doing, and just make extra money, just work a lot that one day, or you can just sort of, do your 8 hours later in the day.
Mm-hmm.
And can be actually really nice because then you can do sort of your other stuff in the morning. So I think having flexibility like that in your schedule can be really nice, and it's a benefit for your practice for those patients that, can't come in until 7 p.m. or whatever.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's a great point. And I found that out, that's kind of what I did. I had I was coordinating two different part-time opportunities together. And, I set myself up for a pretty long day on Wednesday where I'd kind of go to one place in the morning and go till about noon. And then I'd pop into the other place and go from 1 till about almost 9. So it was a super long day, but it was, I made a lot of money doing that. And, I made sure that Thursday was pretty late start. So kind of ended up working out well. And, so with the last couple minutes here, and awesome. Thank you. The person who asked the question said thank you. So thanks for the question. And for the, for I guess the remaining bit, the last few minutes we have left here, I just thought maybe you can share maybe some top tips or final kind of points about kind of part-time work and piecing in together stuff. So I'll leave you the floor and go ahead.
So yeah, I'd say my main tips are, go in with the mentality of like, what can I learn from this? What can I get out of these different job opportunities? Instead of going in with the sort of like, oh, I wish I could find a full-time job, but I can't, and this is just what I have to do. There's a lot of great advantages to part-time, and so sort of make it worth your time, and learn what you can. Um, like I said, it's really important to be flexible. So if you're kind of a scrappy person that's able to ask for what you need, let employers know what you need, what you're looking for. This can be really great, but you do yourself have to put in a lot of work and effort. And then kind of lastly, like we were talking about with contracts and stuff, make sure you're really careful with what you're signing. And this goes along with things like non-compete clauses. Make sure that you're signing stuff that's going to allow you to work in multiple places, because you're going to have to. And so don't sign a contract that says you can't work within a 5 mile radius of this practice when you might need to do that. I think this is usually employers are pretty reasonable with this kind of thing. They understand that you need to work multiple days, but make sure you're not signing off on things that won't work for you in the long run. And I'd say the last thing, particularly about like working Saturdays, make sure you let them know like you can't work every Saturday. Like put that out there at the beginning. Like
Yeah, that's
I
super
might,
critical.
with one Saturday off a month, or like I'm willing to work a different
Yep.
day one week or whatever. Because if you don't sort of set those, standards up at the beginning, you're going to have expectations, and then it'll be harder to kind of ask for those things later on. So be really upfront about what you need, what your goals and expectations are, and kind of make the most out of this opportunity while you have it.
Yeah, awesome tips. Thank you so much for sharing. And, back to the Saturday thing, make sure you give yourself a chance to kind of decompress on a weekend for sure. Super important. I coordinated between a couple of offices and, I was kind of alternating Saturdays. That's kind of how I kind of was able to coordinate. I said, okay, I'll do every other Saturday here. And then I did every other Saturday at the other, but just one Saturday a month. So I always had that one Saturday just to kind of enjoy and not do optometry, right? Because that's super important. And on that subject, we've got our next talk happening in about 30 minutes. For those of you who've been following along with us all day, you can check it out in the exhibit hall. We'll be talking actually non-clinical optometry careers. So super excited for that one. But Sathi, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day. And we'll talk soon, I'm sure.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Before we sign off, before we end the stream, there's one last question that came in. One last one. I was literally about to press stop, but we'll answer that question that came in. So the question is, given that the weekends are more desirable, is it reasonable to ask higher pay on the weekends? I know what my answer is, but I'll let you go.
Absolutely. That was actually something I had meant to mention is absolutely ask for a higher rate Saturday or for a shorter work day. Sometimes they'll only want you for 6 hours or something, but I think it's absolutely reasonable to ask for a higher rate. You're giving up something by working Saturdays, that you're not necessarily giving up working a Monday. So yes, ask that higher rate.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree 100%. So with that, we can now sign off. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Mhm.